And welcome, everyone. This is the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan, and we've got a great show lined up for you all today. But before we get into it, just want to take a quick moment to thank everybody for joining us this week. If you like this episode or any of our other episodes, please make sure to leave a like down below, subscribe, and comment. If you want access to our Discord server as well as some extra content, make sure to head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/themindsculptors or check out the link in the description. Today we are going to be talking about Stax, everybody's favorite archetype. And joining me today is my good friend Cobble, as usual. Cobble, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Good to be here.
Good. Also making his first appearance on our show is one of the he's been a sculptybois for a while. We just haven't had a chance to get him on. Is Charles. Well, people would know you as the mono white guy.
Yeah. They sometimes also know me as Michael LeVine.
Don't do that. It's confusing.
Oh, no. So, Charles, thank you for joining us. Glad to have you, finally get you on. And the best episode to really have you premiere is talking about Stax.
Yes.
So, glad to finally have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Spoilers, if you didn't hear. We are having Dr. Michael LeVine is joining us today as well. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing? How's everyone doing?
You know what? So I got to be honest with you. Today it was 27 degrees outside finally, and it felt like summer to me. I walked outside and I was like, "Oh, I don't need a jacket. It's only 30." Like It was about negative 27 at one point here in Lincoln this week, so it's been rough, but we have made it through.
Negative 27 is quite bad. I usually think in Celsius, and that negative 27 in Fahrenheit is just so bad.
It's unbelievably cold, and I was surprised my car started. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, ours didn't. Our tires had gone flat on the one side, and the flat tires froze to the ground. So we had to salt the tires to get them so that we could inflate them and then be able to move the van.
Oh my gosh, that's awful.
Guys, I just came home.
Well, I know we got some friends and stuff that are down in Texas. So to everybody who is in Texas, our thoughts and prayers go out to you guys. Hope everybody is staying safe and most importantly, staying warm. So we're all thinking about you guys. Mm-hmm. Today we are talking about Stax, and this is something all four of us are pretty well versed in, I would say.
Passionate.
And what'd you say?
We're passionate about Stax.
Very passionate about Stax.
Yeah, so much we even associate our identities to it, A
little bit. So Charles, when we're talking about Stax, what are we really talking about as what this means as an archetype?
Stax is an archetype. It kind of differentiates a bit from Death and Taxes, though I'm just going to refer to Cobblepott. You had a tweet earlier today that I'll just quote you on. Stax archetypes play effects that break down the avenues exploited by unfair strategies. They force other decks to play fair magic, and you hear this word a lot, fair magic, from Stax players. What does it mean? It's kind of like a loaded term, but it really is like a style of control. It's if you're a control player who's played 60 card 1v1 Magic, and you like the idea of playing these really tight games against your opponents, messing around with their resources, and then coming out with a really strong finisher at the end. That is sort of the idea of Stax as well. You're playing cards that manage the resources on the battlefield, manage aspects like card advantage, manage other aspects like tempo as well, and outplay your opponents. Not necessarily with overwhelming.
Well, attempt to.
Yes, attempt to outplay your opponents. I mean, this is EDH we're talking about. It's 4-player multiplayer Magic. It's a lot different here. But yeah, that's sort of Stax from a very high level philosophical perspective. How you do it actually kind of really varies and depends, and hopefully we'll go over all those different kinds of ideas across a widespread kit of different Stax cards that we'll use as examples.
Right. Now, when we're talking about stacks, there's kind of different categories, right, of what it is, because not all stacks are the same. So Michael, yeah. when we're talking stacks, Michael, really, what are kind of those core pieces that we think of when we're talking, like, what are these different types of stacks effects?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I think of if something's a stacks effect or not, I usually think, does this stop people from winning the game, or does it not? And if it's a card that's going to stop people from winning the game, there's a good chance it's a stacks effect. There is kind of like a caveat on that, because pillow fort effects, which are not exactly stacks effects, also do stop people from winning the game. But these are ones that I think, and it gets back to Cobblepott's quote about making people play fair Magic. You're stopping them from winning the game by stopping them doing their broken thing that they want to do. Whether that is to play this incredible fast mana and just ramp out powerful spells, so you're playing things like Null Rod, or they want to reanimate something crazy early on, so you're playing Graveyard Hate. What the real goal is just to stop them from doing the broken thing. And I think any card that doesn't stop the broken things, for me, it almost feels like it's not a stacks card. It might be an annoying card, but for me, it's almost not a stacks card.
Yeah, I think like a good example of this, to piggyback off of you, Michael, is like Painter Servant. Like, that card doesn't really do anything, but then when you pair it up with something like Iona, which is no longer playable, but for a while Iona, right? Iona is really the stacks piece. Painter Servant just adds that extra quote unquote annoying effect.
Right, it's an amplifier for it, I would say.
Yeah.
You had Charles. You had a couple of categories in some articles that you've written before. You kind of broke down some broad categories for how it is that you classified different types of stacks effects. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll talk about it. I know that you and Pongo actually recently did a podcast on deck building efficiency. It's a great podcast. You guys should give a listen to it. I've written my own articles about values and paradigms about how we understand card advantage and card velocity. I have another article coming out later in the future talking more about stacks and focusing on this term that Pongo and Cobblepott used, and actually Michael used in his interview with Braden from CDH Cast, called Action Economy. But in this other article that I have coming out soon, I established 4 different kinds of staxes, because not all staxes are created equal, and it's really important that I think that we kind of distinguish this. Now, you can have your own categories. I'm not going to debate about that or disagree with that. But it's just more like, I think that this is sort of helpful. So the first one that I mentioned is commanding stacks. These are like your stacks pieces that people have in some ways built decks around. Lavinia being, a really good example. But
I wasn't the one who said it this week. It wasn't me.
Yeah, I tipping my hat to you, Callahan, right? But there's recently a Rule of Law Discord that Michael and I are in, and Rule of Law has sort of become like the card similar to Ad Nauseam, almost like it's bipolar counterpart on the opposite end of the spectrum of, instead of being fast and winning, it's very controlling. And decks have been built around this idea of Rule of Law. Winter Orb is another one. I mean, like, I think that's been held up because of Urza and Static Orb. Like, those two specific orb pieces have really defined, in a way, a deck that when you play that card, the whole table revolves around that card existing on the table now.
And something that is important about that is that for this category, it would be effects that are going to have a detrimental or a controlling effect on opponents, regardless of what their archetype is, and
exactly
what their plan of attacking the table would be. Yes. So
the funny thing about Winter Orb or Static Orb is that when I think about Stax effects, I almost never include those two cards in my mental model, specifically because they don't really force people to play fair Magic. Right? There's not there in the at least in the CDH meta, not many people are cheating on lands that often.
Right.
So this is just like a general effect that kind of slows things down and everyone gets a little bit annoyed. It doesn't necessarily stop people from doing the broken things. So when I start building Stax decks, I pretty much never have those in the list to be cut from the beginning because they just feel a little bit. They don't force fair Magic. They just force slow Magic.
Well, there was a point in time. There was a point in time that those were very effective in doing that. So you look at your tap down effects like
Kismet, Frozen Ether, Blind Obedience,
and combine those with Blood Moon effects or
Back to Basics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those used to be very effective until the printing of Dockside Extortionist.
Mm-hmm.
And Dockside Extortionist is kind of like the one card that, on the one hand, it in and of itself makes it such that you really don't care about what your lands are doing, because you can almost always in a multiplayer game, and especially in a multiplayer game where people are developing with a lot of fast mana that's normally in the form of rocks or in the form of carpet and that kind of thing. That you're going to be very mana positive after casting it.
It's
that in and of itself is a huge factor, but because it has proliferated through the metagame so abundantly, that any deck, I mean, really, there's not going to be a deck that's got red in its color identity that's not running Dockside Extortionist. It's just that good. So
and combine that with
trying
Mana
to
Dorks,
attack that,
right? Combine that with Mana Dorks. So even if they're not in red, if they're in green, they're on a ton of 1 mana Dorks that do not get affected by Winter Orb, right? So,
well, and it's very important to point out too with the Dockside conversation just for a moment before we get too sucked into this, but this is something that, when we're discussing Stax effects, right? There's a lot they can vary in how they present themselves and all these things. But by and large, they show up on artifacts and enchantments. And those are both triggers to Dockside.
Yep.
So if you don't have the right ones, they can be problematic in the wrong situation.
They can backfire.
So, and that's going to lead into some of the discussion we're going to be talking about further down the line.
We are getting a little too ahead of ourselves, I think.
Yeah, but so when we talk, so what are when we really get into it then, and we're talking about the Stax pieces, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the Stax pieces that we're really going to see on more often, I suppose, is where I'm trying to go.
So I want to preface this by also saying that commanding stacks and the next term that I'm going to use is called preemptive stacks. These are more descriptive terms rather than prescriptive. It's not like Winter Orb is always going to be a commanding stacks piece, but as Cobblepott mentioned, it used to have this kind of dominance. And this also carries back to the previous conversation that we were talking about with Painter Servant. Static Orb doesn't do much because you have players like Adnos players who will just throw down a Dockside Extortionist, generate lots of treasure tokens, throw down the really cheap mana rocks like a Mana Crypt or a Mana Vault, and start chaining off spells to winning the game. You have Underworld Breach lines where you just generate infinite mana off of a Lion's Eye Diamond, etc., etc. And it's other effects, for example, Static Orb plus Bind Obedience amplifies it so that those treasure tokens come into play tapped and they only untap 2 at a time, right? And things like that. But once again, those are amplifying effects. What the next term that I want to get at is called preemptive stacks. These are meta-defining stack pieces, and meta is the key word here. Dockside Extortionist has really changed the EDH meta since its inception, I think 2019. And so
correct.
Yeah, and so enter the battlefield triggers when they printed Thassa's Oracle and Theros. both Dockside Extortionist and Thassa's Oracle, and then you have other cards like Emil making the scene. There was a huge emphasis on Enter the Battlefield triggered effects, right? And we saw like the printing of a card like Hushbringer come into play, and now we moved away from a Flash Hulk meta where people were running like cards like Containment Priest and Hollow Moonlight to playing cards that focus on Enter the Battlefield Torpor Orb-like effects. Because that was the name of the game now. It was how do we beat a Dockside Extortionist, right? And like I said, there are other ways to deal with it, like the Static Orb plus Blind Obedience type of thing. You amplified a commanding Stax piece so that it can deal with a Dockside Extortionist, right? But there are other ways to engage with it. Other people recognize the fact that in order to loop Dockside Extortionist, because they'll either play a bounce spell with it, or they'll loop it with Temur Sabertooth, or Emil, well not Emil, but with a Temur Sabertooth, or like an Underworld Breach line, Rule of Law effects became more prevalent. But I think like Rule of Law has always just been a prevalent Stax piece, so I would say that it's more of a commanding Stax piece. These are relative terms.
I mean, it fell out of favor during the Flash era.
Yeah.
It was had less, right. Its power was less tangible under Flash because it actually helped Flash become more powerful. It was easier to protect Flash, whereas now, in the Flash era, the games were not very much about development. So what would happen was, and we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here because we're going to talk about, Rule of Law specifically in a little bit here. But, just very quickly, the metagame during the Flash era was not about development. It was just kind of sandbagging and identifying the right moment to win over the top of somebody else's win, basically. And, everyone just trying to have as much interaction artillery as possible to win the counter war to get the Flash that actually resolved.
Yes.
Today's metagame is much different than that. Today's metagame is about developing quickly and then bootstrapping after a large effect like an ad nauseum, or just finding an opening and casting Oracle plus Consultation. Both of those are all three of those angles. Fast development in the beginning game, bootstrapping after doing an ad naus, or trying to cast Oracle plus Consultation. All three of those are stymied by having a Rule of Law in effect, which is why it's so powerful now.
Yeah, and so it's more of a commanding Stax piece now, but it was, I would say, I guess, like a preemptive Stax piece before in the past, because the decks that had stopped outside of Flash were like Elsha, and I think Kaikar was around at that time as well. And
anything in Jeskai.
Yeah, anything in Jeskai, really. And so, it pivoted from being like a card that you played against a specific deck to a card that you could just play and feel confident that it would work against any deck. And that's sort of like the distinction between preemptive and commanding Stax. And so when you sit at a table and you see a card get played, you can sort of like test your analytical skills and identify, well, is this Stax piece a card that this person is running to hate out a specific archetype of things, or is this a card that is like the centerpiece of their deck's commanding force as a Stax deck, right? And so the next Stax archetype Stax definition that I want to get at is taxes, and this is like the most iconically, like where the name Death and Taxes comes from is like Thalia. Trinisphere might count as one. It really depends on how you look at it, because Trinisphere actually doesn't add additional taxes. It just sets the value of a card to exactly 3.
Right. It functions more like a Rule of Law more than a tax effect.
Yeah. And actually, Great point there. Rule of Law restricts you to only one spell a turn. Trinisphere sort of restricts you to one spell a turn, but if you manage to get to like a larger critical mass of mana, you could chain multiple spells through Trinisphere such that it doesn't matter anymore. Like if you manage to, get like a Zerda Grim Monolith activation, it just doesn't matter anymore that there's a Trinisphere, right? And this is sort of, and that is sort of the main essence of what a tax is. It's like a Stax in a way that its latent purpose is to prevent your opponents from being able to do something. Like a Thalia is really powerful after you resolve
specifically on curve.
Yeah.
is the big point there.
Yeah, like if you play a Thalia early on, it's really hard for your opponents to establish that development with all those mana rocks that they have, or play the tutors that they want to play, the non-creature tutors specifically, and she gives you that upswing in tempo. These are more of like a tempo-paced card. As what I said earlier about like a control deck wanting to control resources but also controlling tempo. Taxes tend to do that pretty well, and usually you build your decks around these taxes so that you don't have to pay much of these taxes, or you don't really care about the taxes to begin with.
The funny thing about taxes, though, is that they're also kind of, in certain metas, preemptive stacks, right? Like, when everyone was playing Scepter combo decks, a tax can just stop you from making infinite mana, because you no longer net mana on the dramatic reversal. And for example, most of the reason why I play tax effects in my Heliod deck is to attack decks that want to loop spells and will not be able to loop them if the spell costs 1 or 2 more. I find that it's more useful to really stop the broken thing than just to stop development. But then during gameplay, that's when I make the decision: am I playing this Thalia to stop development, or am I going to hold it until I want to play it to stop someone from comboing? But really, when I put the deck together, I usually think, how important it is to have this effect right now? Is there going to be a lot of Scepter? Is there going to be a lot of like Divining Top shenanigans? Are those decks popular? That's usually what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and actually, that's a great point. My favorite tax card, and I don't really see anyone else using it. I don't encourage people to use it, but this is like my personal favorite. It's Suppression Field. I always gush to Michael about it. Obviously, you wouldn't run it in Heliod Ballista because it's terrible in Heliod Ballista.
Yes.
It actually just shuts
He
up.
gushes about it to us too. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, but like the fact that it hits fetch lands, it hits like planeswalkers. Like, what's the new planeswalker from Commander Legends? That's the new hotness right now.
Tevesh Zat.
Yeah, Tevesh Zat. It hits Tevesh Zat, right? It hits the Sensei's Divining Top. I just love it. It's also really great with Isochron Scepter the same way too, because they now have to pay 4 to activate their Scepter. It also offsets Zerda's own ability to cheat with Grim Monolith. And even with like a Reigns of Bright Hearth combo, you can't go infinite with Basalt Monolith either while there's a suppression field. It's like a tax that also just happens to stop specific infinite combos because of the exact numbers that it specifies. And so there's a lot that we can go into taxes here, and that might just be its own separate discussion entirely outside of this. But just wanted to establish the fact that if you see a number printed on a card and it says, this costs more, or players can't play this unless they pay whatever, right? That tends to be a tax-like effect. But whether or not it commands the game, and that's something to also recognize, that a card can be more than one thing by this definition. It's just sort of understanding sort of how that card works is sort of what these definitions are used for. So that way you can get an idea of like, okay, well, if I just generate enough mana, because the only problem with that Basalt Monolith loop is because that Basalt Monolith specifically taps for 3, and Zerda reduces the cost by 2, and then Suppression Field increases the cost by 2 to untap it. If you only produce 1 more extra mana, maybe or the activation cost of 1 mana less, then maybe you could get things to work, right? And so understanding how those numbers fit into the scheme of things is sort of how you want to play around against taxes, but also how you want to play with taxes as well, if you want to really trap an opponent into a corner like that. And so now the fourth and final one are suggestive taxes / staxes. And originally this was just suggestive taxes, and suggestive is the key word here. So when I talked about taxes, we talked about required taxes that your opponents had to pay. There was no way around it. But what if, your opponent can choose to pay a tax, or you get something off of it instead? So it's like Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora. And this is also really important because these cards are usually phrased in the way as triggered abilities, right? Whereas taxes are static abilities. Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora and even Smothering Tide, they're all triggered abilities. They go on the stack. You actually don't have to pay for these things until the trigger resolves, right? And this leads into very like sleight of hand type of plays that your opponents could use against you when that happens, because you don't know if your opponent's actually going to sink in the mana to those taxes until after that trigger resolves. But the other thing is that your opponent has a choice. And the reason why I now call these suggestive taxes / staxes is because we now have something called Mangara, the diplomat, who has this unique ability where it could be a rule of law effect if your opponent decides to play it like a rule of law effect, where they just don't want to give you the cards, and so they don't play the extra cards. And the reason why these also just kind of differentiate from your regular like rule of laws or your regular like Thalias, where there is like a surcharge on a spell, or there is like a hard restriction on the number of spells that you can cast, is because at any point in the game, if your opponent feels like that they can win the game, they will just ignore these suggestions. They will ignore the suggestive tax. They will be like, draw as many cards as you like from your Sixth Study. I don't care. I have a whole Breacher out, or I have a Narset out,
or I already cast Silence.
Yep. Yeah, and so and that's sort of like the downfall of these suggestive pieces. But the reason why people play these suggestive pieces is because usually the suggestion is very, very strong. Mystic Remora has a very strong suggestion here of like, you really don't want to cast that non-creature spell, because if you do, I might just draw into my win con, or I might just draw into sufficient counter magic to interact and defend my win con.
Right.
Well, Mystic Remora is almost not a choice, because it comes down turn 1 and it asks you to pay 4, right? So
yeah, that's what I'm saying. You really don't want to cast that non-creature spell.
Right. In
that's
that case,
that's the suggestion.
Absolutely. Yeah. In that case, the suggestion isn't so much about whether you pay for it or not. It's whether or not you choose to stymie your own development and slow yourself. You choose to forego maybe casting all of the fast mana, hoping that your opponent is going to let the fish go, and then maybe the next turn you do that. But what that's done is that has suppressed the development of the table if everybody's respecting it, and it acts as a stacks effect in that capacity.
I've seen plays, by the way, that I think are really hilarious. Is someone plays a Mystic Remora and another person's like, yeah, I'm going to play all these mana rocks. And the guy's like, great, I guess I'm drawing all these cards. And the person's like, I'm going to cast Silence now. And the person's like, all right. Yeah. And then it's like, here's a windfall.
There's an interesting, and it's a little bit of a digression, but the question of, do you pay for the Ristic, or do you cast spells into Mystic Remora and that kind of thing? Those both get very interesting with multiple players. So when nobody has fed the fish, it is the correct play almost always for everyone to not feed the fish and for everyone to respect it. But once a couple of people have stopped respecting that, so let's say that you're, first person plays a fish, and then the player in second and third position both disrespect it and play a whole bunch of fast mana. Now, you as the fourth player have to make a choice. Do you respect that fish because it's quote unquote the right thing to do, or do you, if you do that, if you do respect the fish in that context, you are allowing everybody else to basically ignore that stacks effect, and you are creating disparity between yourself and the rest of the table. So it actually becomes at that point correct for you to maintain development with everybody else to avoid falling behind. So it's a weird, I'm not going to say prisoner's dilemma, but it's a variation of that context, and we'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah. I think the important part with the suggested taxes or stacks effects is that the good ones cost very little and the bad ones cost a lot. So like, I don't play Mangara in Heliod because it costs 4, and I'm hoping by the time I have 4 mana, I have a rule of law effect in play. If it costs 1, then I might play that effect for 1. Same with Smothering Tide for me. I mean, unless you're doing broken things with Smothering Tide, like casting Wheels with a Smothering Tide out, you're basically not getting that much mana, and when they want to draw a bunch of cards, they're going to draw a bunch of cards. And 4 mana is a lot to not actually stop someone from winning. Whereas Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora are 1 and 3 mana. The fact that they're cheap and they get you resources to interact with people makes them just very, very good. So
right.
Well, and that's what's kind of interesting about, you know, these things, and we'll kind of get into this, is because there's certain things like, you know, in Lavinia that we avoid for a variety of reasons, but avoid just from the idea of like
Lavinia is a great example for this at distinguishing taxes from suggestive taxes, right?
Right.
Yeah, because
and so the big thing with Lavinia is you can't play those tax effects that increase the CMC or increase the casting cost of the card, but you can use the suggestive ones. And like what Michael said is like the how expensive they are matters a lot, because, you know, Mangara, we're not going to play Mangara. That's 4 mana, and we really got to be doing more to develop because we don't have that much of a powerful, you know, like with Heliod, for example, I think too, you know, your Heliod isn't going to be a creature most of the time. And so, you know, in that scenario, you want to play something that's more impactful at 4 mana, because what's coming out of the command zone isn't generating as much value as, like, say, a Kenrith.
Yep.
But not to devolve too much to get into all of that. But so Cobble, when we look at we've talked about the definitions, we've looked at all of them and kind of where they all fall. But like, what are the Stax effects when you see them? What are kind of the cards and what do they do?
Right. So it's good to kind of have like an abstract way to categorize the pieces for thinking about them in terms of when you're building your deck. So, you know, the preemptive Stax pieces that are kind of like metagaming and deciding, all right, which kind of effects are going to hit the most opponents, or hit the specific opponents in the metagame that I know that I'm going to be up against in the most compromising way. It's good to have those categories kind of understood in that context. But talking about the pieces and the I would say more concrete categories, it is also important just to understand when you have a choice between multiple pieces, or you've got a tutor in hand and you want to choose the thing that is going to interact with the board state in a very specific way. You want to know what tools you have available before you make that choice. So starting off is going to be artifact hate. So this is going to include things like Null Rod, Stony Silence, Collector Oof, those types of cards. And when you're looking at a Stax piece, you want to think about, I like to think about 3 things. Is it going to impact development? Is it going to impact the value generation or value engines of your opponents? And is it going to impact the win cons of your opponents? So when looking through those kind of like 3 dimensions for each of these, it's useful to give you an idea of its utility based on a board state. So Null Rod effects, they are absolutely going to hit the development of universally all lists in the CEDH metagame, because all CEDH lists are going to run at least, you know, Mox Diamond and Chrome Mox, Mana Crypt, and Soul Ring. And most of them are going to run many more rocks in addition to that as well. So you're going to hit development, so it's going to be very good early game. And it's also going to impact the win cons of decks that are relying on Dockside, Extortionist, Isochron Scepter, Ballista, Reservoir, those kinds of things. So that is, I think, kind of the first category that you want to look at.
The funny thing about that category is that when I decided I wanted to play Heliod, the reason why I felt like Heliod was a good choice is because even though I can't play Null Rod or Stony Silence, I didn't think it mattered that much to not be able to play them. At the time, the broken things I was worried about were Oracle Consult, Flash Hulk, and I was like, yeah, Null Rod stops development, but like having to give it up is not a big deal if I get to play Heliod Ballista. Nowadays, it's a bigger concession to say I'm going to play a deck that can't play Null Rod.
Right.
And it's a funny thing about how that evolves. If more cards like Darkside come out, there will be a point where it's like a very bad idea to play Heliod because you can't play Null Rod.
Right. Well, and like, Lavinia, for instance, I mean, we run 19 artifacts because, we're in blue-white, so you have to have some way to ramp. But we play Karn, and it just, like, in my opinion right now, like, I feel like Karn is a worthwhile include, but that's not even really what matters. Like, these are the type of effects that, even if you can't play Collector Oof, even those asymmetric effects are still worth considering and playing in a lot of situations, and especially right now when we're in this dockside meta where everything is, turbo dockside. If you can land a Karn, they have to now deal with your Karn.
Yeah, I mean, even like Blind Obedience is way better now because dockside is such a good card. Like, just making the treasure enter tapped is such a big deal. It's crazy. I actually just want them to print another Blind Obedience effect so I can play it in Heliod.
Blind Obedience is insane, by the way. Every time I play that card now, I just find that this card is very deceptively powerful when I play against my opponents. I mean, like in the Heliod deck that I run, I'm not playing Heliod Ballista, but like the original Heliod. I run Storage Matrix with Blind Obedience, like I said earlier, and that proves to be very effective against Dockside, simply because they don't have access to their treasure tokens immediately because of Blind Obedience, and next turn they have to choose to either untap their creatures, their lands, or their treasures.
Right.
And
now another
deficiency.
Another really effective effect against these dockside decks right now, Cobble, would be rule of law effects, correct?
I mean, it can be. So depending on how it is that they're exploiting dockside, if they're exploiting dockside in a context in which they have to recast it, then yes, rule of law is going to hold it down. If they're using MEL or something to blink the dockside, then they're going to be able to move right through it. But this is true. This is another category of Stax effects that we want to be looking at, and this is, I would say, the most important Stax category in the current metagame, just because it is so powerful in fighting kind of like every aspect of most lists that exist. So kind of going back to where we were, categorizing or talking about what Stax is and saying, forcing other lists to play fair Magic. What is the way that lists are trying to be unfair? Most of the unfairness that we see, most of the degeneracy that we're seeing is, basically people abusing Oracle and Consultation, and people abusing mass draw like ad nauseum. Like that's the dominant thing that's in the metagame right now. But I mean, even things that are somewhat less dominant, like Underworld Breach or even Food Chain, which has fallen way back. All of those are all completely ineffectual if somebody has a rule of law effect in play. So rule of law is hitting the development, going back to those dimensions again. Essentially, all lists are going to be slowed significantly by the presence of a rule of law. So the earlier that you can get a rule of law into play, if you can get a turn 2 or turn 1 rule of law, then you are making it such that the people who have designed their decks to be as high acceleration as possible are going to be at a significant disadvantage against lists that are expecting a rule of law to be in play.
And when you say all lists, like it really is all lists. When I first started playing Heliod, I remember doing an interview with CDH TV. We were going over my list after the DDM tournament, and he asked why I didn't play Rule of Law. And like, simply, I just said, it's really hard for me to play under Rule of Law, so I can't play it. Like, it makes me have a hard time playing. And of course now, like, Heliod is one of the major rule of law decks, and now I'm on every rule of law effect, but it's hard to play with rule of law, and often I have to think so many turns ahead.
Yeah, I remember having this conversation with you about it because I was running rule of law back then, and you said the exact same thing. And I said I can play a rule of law, but yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I still find it very hard to play with rule of law in play, and a lot of my gold fishing is like figuring out how to sequence things with the rule of law in play, because it's very, very tricky. Because the thing about rule of law that is great is that everyone starts telegraphing what they're going to do, right? Because they really need to plan what spell to cast on what turn, but that means that you also telegraph what you're doing. And especially if you're relying on like tutors for Walking Ballista that reveal Walking Ballista, it's just so obvious what I'm doing as I'm doing it. So you have to really think about what order you want to do everything, and it's very, very complicated because it really does hit all lists. Unless you're Cobblepott and you play a list where you never have to cast any spells if you don't want to.
I have a trick to playing.
You just activate abilities.
I have a trick to playing rule of law, and this will actually go into the whole activating abilities thing. And this deals with Cobblepott, what you and Pongo were talking about with the action economy in your previous podcast. So in a normal game of Magic, like in a game of Magic as Richard Garfield intended, it's a 60-card game, 20 life total. You untap, upkeep, draw, play a land, play something, pass the turn, right? What you can play is defined at its core essential to how much mana you have. That is literally the only limitation to what you can do in the game, other than the number of cards in your hand. So your upper bounds and lower bounds are dictated by cards in hand and mana resources available to cast those said cards. Rule of law is interesting because it puts an artificial cap to that. It puts an additional metric to those types of measurements and says that, well, now it's not just how many cards you have or how much mana you have, but it's also how many spells you can cast in a single turn, right? I would not be surprised if Wizards one day prints a rule of law that's like, you can only play 2 spells a turn or something like that, though I think obviously that's worse than rule of law, but it's not. I don't think it's not within the realms of experimentation that Wizards is doing right now for mono white. But the thing is that this is something.
Just wait, they're going to print an asymmetric rule of law effect. I can feel it in my bones.
Callahan and I. All right. Okay, Callahan and I have been discussing about this, but we do believe that the Elish Norn, because Phyrexians by design are designed to have these asymmetrical effects, and they also tend to be like slightly off colored. Like the original Elish Norn had actually like a black effect printed on her, but that was like the anti-positive to like her effect that was the mono white one, which was the +2/+2, right? And so we do think that the new Elish Norn that's coming out sometime later will be a asymmetrical rule of law. We just don't know how much she'll cost, right?
I can just feel it.
Yeah. So
sorry, go ahead,
I think
Michael.
the thing you were going to get to, though, is that if you limit the number of spells, but you have a lot of abilities you can use, you can still use all your mana efficiently, right? And that's kind of the trick. And certain decks are very good at that. Like Rule of Law does nothing against Yasan. Like it just doesn't do anything. I'm very happy that deck's no longer in favor because it was not an easy deck for me to play against. It's the same with decks like Najeela, where if you say they can only cast one spell, they just are going to use Najeela's ability. And now they're just going to load up on creatures because there's no limitation on the number of creatures. And they have a nice way to generate them. So Rule of Law effects are not kind of the be-all, end-all of saying, you can only take one action per turn, as much as we'd like to pretend they are. But in the current metagame, they're pretty close.
They really are.
And this is once again going back to what I said about the action economy. The action economy, as you put it, Michael, your spells do not define your actions, but most players associate spells per actions. Like if you have to pick up your library to find a card, that is usually encapsulated within a single card. But if you can pick up your library, find a card, and put that card into play, well, that's just tooth and nail, right? You've basically done 2 actions through the performance of a single card, and these are like the kinds of cards you want to watch out for when you're playing with Rule of Law. Suppose that you don't have a way to break parity with Rule of Law, right? You don't have like a Kenrith in play. Kenrith is an excellent commander with Rule of Law because he basically has 5 spells printed as abilities onto his body, right? He also is just really big, and so he can negotiate the battlefield with just combat. That's the same thing with Najeela. Like players need to sometimes think about when there's a Rule of Law in play, what are the actionable things that your opponents can do? And think about this also in another sense, right? Like if your opponent has a Thrasios out and they put a lot of lands into play tapped, but you have a back to basics, right? Even though that players is doing a lot of Thrasios activations, as long as that back to basics is in play and all the cards that they hit are lands, it's not actually qualifiably valuable. It's just a lot of quantitative action in the action economy, but it's not productive economy.
It's not useful economy, right?
Yeah. And so when you want to do threat assessment in a table that has a Rule of Law out to determine like, okay, well, what are the things that I'm worried about, right? You want to like see which players are actually being very productive with a Rule of Law out, and you want to really target on those players and hit those weak spots. Like I also run all the Rule of Law effects in my Heliod deck, but I actually also run like something like Sphere Safety in my Heliod deck because I make enchantments. And this is to pretty much like deter decks like Godo or like Najeela or like Derevi that try to use combat as a way to break that action economy, right? Suppression Field once again is like the card that I nerd over with because once again activated abilities become the prime currency in this type of economy where your spells are capped. Like the more activated abilities you can activate, typically the more productive you are. Though I just gave an example where you had a Thrasios player who wasn't being productive because there was a back to basics. But you get the idea, right? And so if you can begin to limit these like constraints, you then begin to put your opponent in a corner. And if you can break parity within those restraints, right, then your opponent becomes more and more vulnerable, and you just like literally a 2/1 enchantment cleric will just run them over in a way. But yeah.
Right. Yeah, this is why I want to get back on one Civi. Just so many actions under Rule of Law. It's
so, and that's an interesting, point because as we kind of move on to the next part of that, Civi uses activated abilities a lot, which we were talking about. So that next kind of category of card is those Curse Totem effects, right, Cobble?
Right. So Cursed Totem and, to a lesser degree, Linvala are your big creature-oriented activated ability stopping effects. And like we're saying, people who are going way in on Rule of Law, or people who are going for maybe the somewhat less powerful or less popular now, kind of like evolution style decks that are very heavily leaning into Thrasios or Kenrith. Those are the decks that are very, very strongly impacted by these types of effects. So Cursed Totem is, again, looking at the 3 dimensions, it hits the development of decks, generally green decks. Because green decks are generally going to use mana dorks, because mana dorks are good for a number of reasons, and mana dorks are just they're one of the biggest surfaces that are disrupted by a Cursed Totem. A lot of value Thrasios and Kenrith are both, I would qualify them as win cons in the one sense if they've gone infinite, but also as value engines in the primary sense. So, but being able to shut them off from being able to do either, from incurring value or from being able to win the game in and of themselves is a very powerful effect. And of course, Najeela as well is also disrupted through a Cursed Totem from being able to win the game. at least in a like a combo oriented way. She can still win by degrees if left to her devices. But Cursed Totem was very strong in previous iterations of the metagame, but you really don't see it as much anymore. I don't know if anybody else agrees with that.
In the Flash meta, it was great because everyone was doing breakfast combo, so you needed activated abilities to win right away. Nowadays, I get really upset when I see a Cursed Totem or a Linvala because I know they're not that impactful overall, but they're very impactful to my Heliod deck or my Lincivi deck. Mm-hmm. So they make me feel bad. But I do think they're a little less strong right now, unfortunately. I cut Linvala from Heliod because I feel like there's too many times where it's a dead 4-mana card in hand. And it's not dead, it's a 3/4 flyer, but that's not the rate you want CDH. So
interestingly enough, I don't run Cursed Totem, but I do run Linvala because she's asymmetric. And for the Stax decks, I'll find that the biggest challenge that I often have is other Stax decks. And like Charles was saying, when you're living in a
problem that must be.
Right, when you're living in a rule of law world, and the currency for breaking parity revolves around creature activations. If you can have an asymmetric means of eliminating somebody else's access to that currency, then that's your kind of direct route to victory. So,
and especially in a deck like Fair Magic, where so much of your parity breaking is based off of your ability to activate abilities.
Exactly. So I think that Linvala is worth it. And I wouldn't, if she was symmetric, I would not run her at all. But just having her,
imagine why,
just having her there to be able to break I'll call it a mirror. Really, any Stax deck going against another Stax deck is you can almost look at them like mirror. Even if you're, not running the same commanders or you've got somewhat different strategies, at the end of the day, you're still probably going to be on rule of law, and you're still going to be looking for ways to break parity with rule of law that are most likely going to have to do with activations.
Yeah, right. Cobblepott and I had a game where we were both playing Stax decks, and we'll talk about this later with table textures, but if you're in a table with another Stax deck, it dramatically slows down the game a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
So, looking at other stuff, there's some stuff, and I might just breeze through some of these just so we can kind of stay on time. We've got effects like Draneth Magistrate, and these are going to hit your commanders specifically, but not just your commanders. If you don't have them cast already, it's also going to hit stuff that's in the graveyard. I know in our show notes we were talking about, a lot of the win cons of, decks like Najeela, Ukima, Godo, Gitrog, they all involve something that's from the command zone or from the graveyard or some iteration of that. And, Draneth Magistrate completely shuts down, food chain combos.
Mm-hmm. Isochron Scepter as well.
Isochron Scepter. So it's stuff like that where Draneth has a lot of value there. Opposition Agent and even Mind Sensor really hit tutors and can sometimes hit win cons if they're timed correctly. Torpor Orb and Hushbringer do stuff against Dox. We touched on this earlier with how those are very effective against Dockside and Thassa's Oracle. And there's so many of these effects. I could keep going through all of them, right?
I do want to say one thing about Opposition Agent and Aven Mind Sensor, just for the context of Stax. And these are, I would say, they're potent effects, just kind of in and of themselves. But a Stax deck makes much better use of Opposition Agent and Aven Mind Sensor because it relies on having board, that its disruption is in the form of board presence. So what'll happen is typically when an opponent has a problematic board, something that's on the board that it needs to get rid of. Most of the time, they're not going to have their answer in hand. Most of the time, they're fine not having an answer in hand. They'll say, okay, I will go and find an answer to this when I need to. All I need is a tutor, and I'll be able to get back on track and be able to move my game along. As soon as you are able to couple a rule of law effect or, something similar that totally disrupts someone's game plan, and then also be able to layer on top of that a tutor disruption, then not only are these people in a situation where they're at disparity with what the Stax player is doing, but they can't go and find an answer to get out of it either. So it's an extremely powerful tool that you have available to you because it plays on multiple layers.
And tutors are the broken.
Go ahead, Michael.
Tutors are the broken cards everyone's playing, right? Because the whole format is full of tutors that were too cheap when they were printed. Like Demonic Tutor at 2 mana is an insanely efficient card with an insanely powerful effect. So in my mind, when I play Aven Mindcensor, it's because it does stop a really broken game-winning play. If the format only had Diabolic Tutor at 4 CMC, I wouldn't care so much about Aven Mindcensor. It's the Neoform, Evolution, Demonic Tutor. Those are the things that necessitate playing Mindcensor because they really are just too efficient and they are broken game-winning cards.
Yeah, Neoform into a Thassa's Oracle is pretty devastating.
Right.
Because there's nothing that you could do until, without knowing that it's going to resolve into it. It could be Thassa's Oracle, it could just be Dockside, and you don't know, right? But actually, to piggyback off of Cobblepott, I'm just going to jump and talk about Spirit of the Labyrinth, because I feel like Opposition Agent, Aven Mindcensor are sides of the same coin with Hull Breacher, Spirit of the Labyrinth, Notion Thief, Chains of Mephistopheles, and Narset, right? That's all of them, right? Because there's a lot of anti-draw effects. Yeah, Uba Mask, right? So a lot of these anti-draw effects as well. Basically, I think Wizards has recognized the two hallmark staples of Magic within the last 25 years has just been card draw and tutor, right? And I don't think we need to really say anything more about these cards. They all have different kinds of wordings, and so it's really important to actually determine the salient details of them. But I don't know if we really if this is the time and place to really talk about it. I mean, I'll give you an example. For one, if you're because this came up recently with Playing with Power in a game that they had that I had to explain to them about how Notion Thief interacted with Labman, since I think it was Ryan. Yeah, Ryan from Playing with Power was playing the game, and I pointed out to him because he was trying to figure out how to get around Notion Thief with his Labman. I was like, Ryan, you have no cards left in your deck, right? Both Notion Thief and Labman are trying to replace the same instance of your card draw here, and you can just choose the Labman effect instead. I had a trick question with a level 2 or level 3 judge at a Command Fest event that I was with before that I gave them, and they it's really fun to watch them squirm under this. And I'll leave this as a bonus question for anyone listening to this. I won't give the answer. You can comment below wherever this is for your answer. But I have a Mishra's Workshop in play, and my opponent has a Damping Sphere, and I have a Contamination out. I tap Mishra's Workshop for mana. What mana does it produce? And that's the question. All right, give me your answer. We'll see who's right. But yeah, these replacement effects are really important. Some of these are not replacement effects. That's the other key thing. Spirit of the Labyrinth is not a replacement effect, right? And that actually does matter for some things. If you drew your card for the turn, right, and you try to draw another card and win off of the Labman effect, you won't be able to win off of the Labman effect because you already drew your card for the turn. Whereas if your opponent has a Notion Thief out and you try to win with a Labman effect, you can win with a Labman effect.
Right.
I think the important point is that when you play Stax, you really need to know exactly how the cards you're playing work.
It's very important.
It's very important. It's really easy to mess it up on your own.
Yes.
And that moves really, nicely kind of into kind of our next portion of this is, when we're talking about when do we want to play our pieces? And there's, a couple different stages of the game where there's like the early stages of the game where you want to be attacking board development, win cons, those sorts of things. And, Cobble, when we're really talking about this, well, and Michael, really honestly, I'm kind of interested to hear your perspective as being a Heliod player. Is like in the early game, what is the disruption you're looking for? And what are you really looking for in the early stages as a Stax deck?
Cobble, you want to go first?
Well, the question I kind of wanted to pose to everybody was, in the early game, how do you go about deciding whether you want to attack development versus do you want to attack win cons? And I know that, so what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of break this conversation in half along the lines of game stage and table texture. And table texture will impact this greatly. And I guess, so the way that I look at it is, if I'm not expecting anybody to be, a turn 2 or, a turn 1 or 2 win, then I normally want to start by attacking development first. But if I am unsure as to whether an opponent is going to potentially win on turn 1 or 2, then if I have a choice, if I have a selection of a couple pieces in hand, or if I got a tutor in hand, I'm actually going to start looking at using attacking the vector that someone's going to try to win through first, and just not trying to attack development at all. And I was interested in getting people's opinions on the way that they think about that.
Yeah.
So I know for me...
Callahan.
You go ahead.
No, Callahan, you go first.
So I know for me, when I'm playing Lavinia, it's very straightforward. Is you are aggressively going for a turn 1 Lavinia because your whole deck is built around her being an incredibly effective hate piece against what's popular in the metagame right now. And really has always been popular. It's kind of what she's been good at. And so on that axis, it's always, you want to attack those win con potentials in that deck and then kind of go from there. But I know, like, in a deck like Golos Prison, you're really looking to attack development because that deck is generally farther ahead on resources than everybody else is in the early game. So you can develop at a much faster pace than everybody else and continue to control the pace of the game. And so I know that's kind of how I look at it, depending on which deck I'm playing.
Yeah, for me, I guess I'm constantly just doing a little bit of math, and I'm saying, how many game actions are other people away from winning the game, and how many am I? And what can I do to make sure I'm closer to winning than they are? So often in the early game, depending on what your hand is, but often that means disrupting other people's development in a somewhat asymmetric way, because like playing Athalia will usually put people farther behind than it puts me. I'll be closer to winning than them. But if I know, for example, that they are an Oracle Consult deck and I've seen them tutor once on turn 1, well, now I know they're probably pretty close to winning. They are either 1 or 2 game actions away from winning probably. So now I need to figure out how I stop that from happening. How do I put them to 3 game actions? And then can I get them to 4 while putting myself down to 3? So that's really how I try to decide what to do. And it's a little tough because, sometimes as you start playing these effects, you may be putting some people behind more than others, and you really have to keep track of how everyone is developing and how everyone is planning to win. But I think it's really important to keep track of how close you are to winning, because it
also depends. Sorry, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
What I was going to say is that I think that the kind of stacks that people think of poorly, they think of the decks they don't want to play against, or that of the people who come to their local game store and make them miserable are the people who seem to only be thinking about how to put everyone else behind and never thinking about how they're going to win. And
Right.
that's why I like Heliod, is that there's always a very clear path to victory, and it's generally like 2 game actions away. It's like play Heliod, play Ballista, or play Tutor for Ballista. And I remember, growing up playing against this awful deck in my game store that it was during the Mercanian Mass saga, and someone was playing blue-white control with Millstone. And nothing feels worse than someone that does nothing then stop you until they draw their Millstone, and then they Millstone you for 20 turns. Nothing feels worse than that. And I think when a lot of people think about stacks in this negative sense, it's because they're used to those decks that, never really put into the calculation how close they are to winning. I don't like playing that kind of stacks, and that's part of how I play the game. I just always want to make sure I'm keeping track of, am I getting closer to winning or not just putting myself further from losing.
I just wanted to get this in here because this is just for if there's anybody who's not a super competitive listener, that puts into context, I think, the biggest thing that a lot of uncompetitive people have against stacks, and a lot of people use Armageddon as the boogeyman, and they'll say, Armageddon is this terrible card because it makes games miserable. And when somebody says that, when someone says Armageddon is bad because it makes games miserable, they are relaying an experience of someone misplaying Armageddon. Mm-hmm. Okay, if somebody casts Armageddon and then fumbles around for 5 turns trying to find a win, that's generally the wrong way to play Armageddon. Armageddon is
in any power level,
right? Armageddon is a spell that you cast, and then you proceed to win very quickly because you have cast it in the context of allowing yourself to have a huge disparity of resource economy after that resolves. If you just cast it and then start everybody back at turn 1, that's like that, as you were saying, Michael, that's not looking at your context within, how close are you to a win versus everybody else, and then seizing on the moment to be able to create disparity and be able to win the game in the gap. And that's something that's really important to understand, because that is a fundamental tenet of playing stacks.
Right. Well, and I think it's very interesting because you talk about Armageddon, and what it does is, especially in a deck like Lavinia, where we are very heavily on an Armageddon Ravages of War game plan in that deck. And that's specifically because it takes advantage of Lavinia's second ability or first ability where, you can only cast non-creature spells with CMC greater than the number of lands that player controls. So you restrict it based on that, and then you're over here being able to do whatever you want with your mana rocks, all those things, and it almost acts as a one-sided Stony Silence in some effects, because everybody can play out all these mana rocks, sure, but if you don't have lands out, you can't do anything. And it's very interesting. And one thing I wanted to touch on too here, where you're talking about in the early game, what is it you're looking for those pre-game actions and things that you were talking about, Cobble? Is it where you're? And I was thinking about this a lot before we started the show today. Is your seat at the table matters so much to what your early interaction and your early stacks pieces are going to be. If I'm going first at the table, right, I will keep a lot more hands that have turn 1 taxing effects, right, than if I'm sitting fourth, because I know in first I'm setting everybody back 2 or 3 turns immediately.
Right. I mean, Callahan, you're giving me PTSD right now. There's a recent playing with power video where I was playing a proof of concept Acroma deck, and Ryan was playing Godo, Bandit Warlord, and he goes first, I go second, and he plays out LED and I think Mana Crypt, and or no, LED and Mana Vault or something like that, and I go turn 1 Deafening Silence. I'm just thinking, why did you have to go before me?
This is so much worse now.
Yeah, why did you have to go before me?
And it's interesting because I know, like, with Golo's Prison, I've had multiple instances where I can go turn 1 Mishra's Workshop, play Mana Crypt, play Soul Ring, play God Pharaoh Statue, or something along those lines. And, like, the difference between that effectiveness going from, like, turn 1 or seat 1 to seat 2 is, like, astronomical how good that play is. Because it's just like like I was saying, it's your decision on what type of disruption you're going to want to play in that early game is really going to be based around, you know, what seat you are at the table, because that makes such a huge difference on what you're really able to do. And that's one of the things that I think is very interesting is when we're talking about when to, like, play out stacks of pieces, right? And we're talking, you know, we're trying to think of where our opponents are at, and you know, what are we trying to stop? You know, it really comes down to, you know, reading your opponents, and what are the things that you are doing, you know, because there's a little bit of, like, homework you've got to do before you can go out and play a stacks deck, because you got to know what's going on in the meta, right?
It's the most important thing. It is 100% the most important thing. I would my hardest beats are against decks where I don't exactly know what their win con is, and I'm really just trying to, like, limit the space of possible win cons, because I don't know how they'll win, but I can be like, well, this is Tatiova. Like, I remember the when I played Tatiova at the DDM tournament, I didn't actually know exactly what the win con was, and I knew it had to use Mystic Sanctuary. I knew it was going to be looping it somehow, but in my head I was like, it's definitely going to be some infinite turn combo, which is not what it is, right? It was actually some Ghostly Flicker combo, and I thought that my, like, Rest in Peace was going to be good enough. I can't remember. I had this idea. I was like, I think I have it handled, even though I don't exactly know how they're going to win. And then I did not have it handled, and they won. And I think if I just, like, read the primer for that deck a couple times, I would have known what to do. Or even recently in the tournament, I lost to Kinnan. I just didn't realize the density of clones in the Kinnan deck and Kinnan Bounce House. So I played a Skyclave Apparition to remove a Stax piece, and then they copied my Skyclave Apparition twice in the same turn and won. And I was like, oh, so that's how that deck works.
Yep. I mean, well, usually it's the first time, right? If you're playing Stacks, like, this might be, like, the unfortunate thing about playing Stacks in a tournament, especially if you're going to a blind meta and you're playing against rogue decks. Because I remember, like, in the Oktoberfest, I think you played against a Kalia deck, right? And no one's ever seen that deck before, right?
Yeah, the Kalia Mad Farm deck that was, like, cheat in Razaketh or reanimate Razaketh, like,
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and so you can't necessarily prepare for those things. But, like, if you play against the deck at least once, I had the same issue with, like, Braden from CDH Cast's Corville deck. Like, as soon as, like, you know, we played the first game, I was like, all right, well, this is how your deck works. This is how it would stop your deck. And Braden was like, you know, you're absolutely right. Thank God we're not playing a second game. I mean, but, like, I think it just takes practice, makes perfect in a way. For me, understanding game design, understanding how a card works, and this goes back to, like, the Notion Thief, Spirit of Labyrinth, like, understanding exactly how your cards function a certain way, not only for stack pieces, but, like, my knowledge about Lab Maniac, because I'm quote-unquote the mono white guy. How do I know how Lab Maniac works against Notion Thief? It's not like I play either of those cards. But understanding how your opponents can win with those effects, like, and how those cards can interact towards a win, even if your opponent doesn't see it, you know, you might see it. And this might give you, like, implicit knowledge, especially if you're playing against something that's rogue, that, not like the rogue creature type, but like rogue as in novel, that you see a card in play and immediately, and this is one of the things that I can do sometimes, is that combat is a really great way of handling this, is that if you attack someone and you see what creatures they decide to block with, and
that's real good.
Yeah, that way you can assess what is their valuable thing. Why did they not want to trade with this creature? Like, why is this creature so important? Because I didn't think this creature is important, but clearly they're not willing to chump block with it, right? And so now I can reassess what I'm going to play. Other things that I do is, in terms of reading opponents, especially if you're playing the same opponent and you're meta, this is a conversation I had with Pongo offline, and he was talking about, players who just do not make the most rational decisions. If you know a player has a repeat pattern of behavior, like they always feed the Mystic Remora regardless of whether or not it's a good idea or not, you can, when you keep your opening hand, you might want to think about okay, well, am I playing against a person who is likely to play turn 1 or turn 2 or something like that, Mystic Study, Mystic Remora, effects, and am I playing against someone who just does not respect those cards? Should I keep a hand with Hull Breacher or Notion Thief or Spirit or Narset, right? Should I mulligan to those kinds of cards? What do I do to tech against those patterns of behaviors from that player? If I'm playing in a table with, other Stax players, I think about the game that I had with Cobblepott, right? He had a Rule of Law out, and I was like, okay, well, he has the Rule of Law out. I just need to play the Tocatli Honor Guard, the Torpor Orb effect, and then we have both bases covered. He's stopping, the farm decks from just gurgitating out a bajillion mana rocks, and I'm just stopping Dockside Extortionist and Thassa's Oracle, right?
And this is something too, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but this is when we're talking about stacks, the Stax player at the table is not always your enemy. There's a lot of times where you can leverage opponent stacks to your advantage. When you're not playing stacks, and that's kind of its whole other thing. But there's these, and when you are playing stacks, like you were saying, Charles, is if you're sitting there and you're going, okay, well, we already got, Cobblepot's already got a Rule of Law effect out. I don't need to put more mana into playing another one. I can sit on this one and then play a different effect. So he's already doing some of the work I already want to be doing. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's a very, interesting way to look at it, and very good point.
Something to layer on top of that even is that even if, it's kind of straightforward and obvious that multiple Stax players at the table kind of have some mutual shared goals, and they can, kind of tag team to sort of keep control of what's happening at the table and make kind of raise the level of all the Stax boats in that way. But even if you're not a Stax player, a lot of times, and I mean most of the time, the Stax pieces that are in play probably should stay in play.
Yes.
So what I mean by this is, let's say that
God, I have never agreed
all
with
four
something you've said so hard.
All four Stax players in this conversation are telling our audience, do not destroy our Stax pieces.
No, it's
real,
yes,
though.
for sure.
It is very real, though. I wholeheartedly agree with you.
But it's frustrating because when you have a Rule of Law out, right, and some Nas player bounces it and then does a bunch of stuff but doesn't win the game, and then the next player wins.
Right.
I always want to pull my hair out when that happens.
Yeah, people kid me.
I was going for it. I was like,
if you're going to remove the Stax piece and then proceed to win immediately after, then yes, it is correct to remove the Stax piece, because that's the thing that's keeping you from winning. But that Stax piece is also very likely keeping someone else from winning too. And if you are not going to proceed to immediately win, you are unnecessarily so think about it in terms of resources. Okay, you want to win, but you can't win because there's a Stax piece in play. Now, what you can do is you can spend resources and a card, a removal, to eliminate that Stax piece from the board, and then spend more resources to go about attempting to win and protecting your win. Alternatively, somebody else is going to want to get rid of that Stax piece as well, and they can spend resources to remove that Stax piece, in which case you have more resources available to you to disrupt that person from trying to win, or even more correctly, to disrupt that person from removing the Stax piece. Because it actually becomes incentivized for you to protect the Stax piece in play, because it makes it more challenging for your opponents to win the game, because they have to commit more resources to doing so.
And that's one of the things I wish if I could impart one piece of knowledge onto everybody, is if you see somebody at the table try to remove a Stax piece, you should probably not let them do that.
Right. Not on a whim, at least.
Right. Like, you should not go, they're removing this rule of law, or here's a better example. They're removing this null rod, and they have 17 artifacts and a jillion treasures. Yeah, well, it's stopping my top from working, so it's fine. Like, I wish it was funny. I've had that happen, stuff like that happen.
You can think of it. Think of it like an infinite counterspell, basically. Yeah. If you don't have any counters in hand, and you let somebody remove the Stax piece that's keeping them from winning, as long as that Stax piece is there, they can't win. And so it's like you don't need to have disruption. You don't need to have a counterspell to stop them from winning, because that Stax piece is keeping them from winning forever until it's gone.
Right.
So you don't need to have the counterspell in hand.
But it's a psychology thing, right? People don't like not doing anything. And I think people in general, I would love if players got more comfortable just not doing anything, just saying, draw, play my land, pass the turn. And
you know what? This is something that Spleenface does that I really appreciate when we play with him, is if he doesn't have something to do on his turn, he'll draw and immediately just go, okay, I pass. And it's immediate, it's fast. He doesn't sit there and hem and haw over it. Yeah. He goes, all right, drew, all right, I can't do anything, I'll pass the turn. And it's...
Yeah, we have a joke amongst ourselves about how it's so weird that when you reduce the number of spells a players can cast a turn to a single spell per turn,
they take longer.
Like, it's so weird. It's like you can play like 3 spells and it takes a faster time for you to. And I joke to Spleenface that I think it's because players are just bad chess players, because they don't understand an action economy where they have the same amount as another player, and they have to think about how to somehow profit from this, because usually they use the cards to profit. They don't really use their decisions to profit.
It's a psychological thing. In software, there's statistics that show that smaller code reviews often take longer than large code reviews, because when there's only a couple of lines of code that have changed, everyone focuses more energy on trying to understand that little tiny bit of code that's changed. Whereas if someone's got thousands of lines of code that's changed, nobody tries to understand it all. And so they gloss over it and it happens more quickly. It's a very similar psychological thing that's happening here.
Cobblepott, stop calling me out. All right. But yeah, I think there's one more thing that I want to piggyback on that. For people who are working on rule of laws, since rule of laws is sort of the new hotness right now, always play 2 rule of laws.
Yes.
Don't leave one in play, because someone is going to try and remove it and be that idiot, and you want the second one for reassurance, so they don't follow up with it afterwards, right?
And removing 2 rule of laws, I mean, short of having a...
Takes 2 more turns.
No, it takes a Cyclonic Rift. One. Cyclonic Rift is the only card. So,
God, I hate that card.
But again, I mean, it takes 7 mana. Trust me, you're going to see it coming. Someone's going to need 7 mana to get rid of.
It's funny in our gameplay video. I don't want to spoil anything. Michael could tell you about a telegraph.
Yeah, okay. I was about to say, I hate having to yell to people about how there's going to be a Psych Rift. It's insane to have to tell people that a Cyclonic Rift is coming, when someone passes the turn with 7+ mana up, and they've recently tutored and they have blue mana and they want to do stuff. It's insane, but somehow everyone's like, what, a Cyclonic Rift? How'd that happen?
Oh my god.
Even if it was a mystical tutor and that it's a Cyclonic Rift, people still are somehow surprised when it happens.
It makes me so
Michael,
angry.
I feel like you and I just come out of the womb knowing when a Cyclonic Rift is coming, right?
Well, I mean, but
it's one of those things though that you play enough stacks and you play enough. Honestly, you play enough CEDH. You start to be able to sniff them out because like you said, like people telegraph it pretty, like if they're presenting 8 mana and they've just tutored, it's pretty well telegraphed that that a Cyclonic Rift is incoming.
Yeah.
Right.
You can't
all
not
that is to say
telegraph.
Cyclonic Rift is the main thing that is kind of the trump to really any board state that you have accumulated by degrees. And that's unfortunate, but it is fortunate that it's extremely telegraphed most of the time. You can see it coming.
You can't hide a 7 mana spell. You just can't. You can't even cheat on the mana for that, right? Like that's a spell that you can't even cheat on the mana. You have to have 7 mana.
It's a nombo with knowledge pool. I've done it to someone where I got into a board state and they're like, I need to Psych Rift, and they try to overload a Psych Rift. It's like, nah, dude, it's now in your knowledge pool. Yeah,
that's why I actually like the knowledge pool locks right now a lot. They're actually quite hard to get out of, and generally the way you get out of a knowledge pool lock is by killing the person that has the knowledge pool. And
you guys are speaking my language.
And the best part about that is just talking the person out of killing you when you have the knowledge pool, because there's no reason to kill the person with the knowledge pool first. So like if you're the Kenrith player against the knowledge pool lock, you should kill everyone else first. Don't kill the guy with the knowledge pool.
Another thing too, just while we're talking about Psych Rift and things like Knowledge Pool, so because Cyclonic Rift is like the one trump that kind of will counter really any Stax board state, it's very much in the Stax players' interest to understand about alternative casting costs and how people can't use 2 alternative casting costs at the same time. The overloaded version of Cyclonic Rift is an alternative casting cost. If they're trying to cast it through something else that's imposing an alternative casting cost, so for instance, Knowledge
Underworld
Pool,
Breach,
or Underworld Breach, those kinds of things, those are already an alternative casting cost. So you cannot overload a Cyclonic Rift in those circumstances, and it's extremely important to understand that and to be able to inform people that they can't do that.
Yeah,
there is. I think like the only instance where you're really able to cast a Psych Rift from your graveyard overloaded is with Yogg's Will. I'm pretty sure. I might be wrong on that, but I think that's because you can cast it as if it's from your hand.
Yes.
Right. It's
and so I'm pretty sure that's like one of the very, very few instances where
it's not a flashback cost and it's not an escape cost. So in that case, you can overload it.
Yeah, because Yogg's Will is not giving an alternate cost to those cards.
Correct.
Right? It's similar to like Crucible Worlds. And the other corner case is like I believe you can cast Git Probe by paying 2 life to pay for its escape cost, because the cost is actually printed on the actual mana cost of the card. That's something that like some players might not know about because they think of it as an alternate casting cost. And this is like one of those things from like a game design perspective, because they could have easily had printed Git Probe as, you may pay 2 life rather than pay this card's cost to cast it, but because of the whole Phyrexian mana implementation, you can actually do that through Underworld Breach.
Well, today I learned.
Yeah.
Well,
card design, man, it's really important. Know your Magic cards. Know how they work.
Right.
Know how your opponents are going to use them against you. Right. Mic drop. We're done.
It's so wild because with like this, discussion, I feel like we could just kind of keep going on and on and on. And I know, Michael, you have another
engagement,
tight schedule. Yeah. So, as we kind of wrap up here, when you look at your decks and what are the let me ask this. I'm going to posit this to everybody. I'm going to, in one or two sentences, what is the like knowledge you want to impart to somebody who's trying to pilot Stax? And Michael, I'll let you kind of kick this one off.
I think that the most important thing when you're playing Stax is when you design your deck, you have to start with how you want to win the game, and then say, well, these are the Stax effects I cannot play because this is how I'm going to win the game. And then you can build your deck. And then when you play the deck, you have to think about that too, because you're going to have made concessions. You're going to play some cards that still hurt you a little bit. And you when you start playing, you have to say, well, is it okay for me to play Thalia right now because my knowledge pool is going to cost 7 mana? Or can I not afford to do that because I really want to cast the knowledge pool in 2 turns? So you really need to focus on how am I going to win, and what Stax effects interfere with that and which ones don't. And I think that that's something that players don't do often enough. I think that they think about, I want to build a Stax deck. They get together a bunch of Stax effects they think are good, and then they figure out how they're going to win the game. And I think that is a recipe for disaster. You're gonna end up having a lot of long, miserable games. So leading with,
and you're gonna lose a lot of long, miserable games.
And that's the other thing. You're not necessarily gonna win, because you can lose with Stax decks. Surprise, surprise! You can lose with Stax decks, and those games,
it's easy to lose.
It's easy to lose, and the games generally go much longer. Like, one of the problems at the Time Twisted tournament for Heliod was that it was a 75-minute round tournament and not 90, and I went to time in 2 of my rounds. So
same here.
Yeah, it just, you are going to have long games. Long games are awful when you lose. They're awful when you're never even really doing anything close to winning. If you want to have fun, you want to play Stax, you want to win, start with your win con, build your base of Stax around that, then play the deck conscious of how you're going to win the game. And then I think not only will your games be more enjoyable, you'll win more often, but you won't feel like every game is this long epic molasses battle. You have a game plan. You're always thinking about winning. It's just so much more enjoyable.
Yeah, Mike, Charles, what would your kind of thing you want to pass on be?
Oddly enough, like my Heliod deck does everything that you said that you shouldn't be doing. But like, I and this is sort of like where my tag comes in, is that if you are going to go in and play with a pile, you should really understand how that pile interacts. Yes. I've seen a lot of games where, like, for example, someone's just sitting around with a Stony Silence looking pretty, and then someone else just drops a Micah Synthlatus, right? And everyone else just looks at the board and is like, do you understand? Do you understand what you've just done? and then you've damned us all, right?
What have you done?
But ironically, the guy who drops the Micah Synthlatus has, like, I don't know, a really fat creature with a really powerful ability that no one can interact with anymore, and they just win the game, right? And they knew what they were doing. It's like, I'm locking this board to this state now. And
can I add something to yours?
Yeah.
With that, and this is if you're a Stax deck that is commander centric, understand how your Stax effects interact with your commander, which kind of jumps off what Charles's point is.
Oh, yeah. Don't run Thalia in like a Lavinia deck.
Yeah, exactly. Dude, I can't tell. As running the Lavinia server, I get a lot of messages from people where it will be like, what do you think of my Lavinia deck? And the first thing I see every time is it's running Lodestone Golem, Thalia, all these taxing effects. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I say is, I'm like, well, that is a huge nombo. Cut all of them. And it's just interesting how you don't think about it at first, because most people see it are just like, oh, I'll just take like Grand Arbiter and port it over to this, and I'll just have a cheaper commander. And what ends up happening is you have a deck that doesn't function all of a sudden.
Right.
But yeah, I wanted to throw that in there because I felt like it really jumped off your point.
Yeah, there's a lot of micromanaging. I mean, like, like the other stack decks I've built align more to like Michael's philosophy. I've been trying to build stacks decks that have been easier to pilot for players, because I find it that like the examples I've just given throughout this whole entire podcast, like with Notion Thief or with like the Underworld Breach, like alternate cost things with like Git Probe and stuff, these are like nuances that like players might not pick up, right? They might not pick up that, like, for example, if I have a Thalia out and a Trinisphere, my opponent only has to pay 3 mana for their Demonic Tutor, right? Because Thalia makes Demonic Tutor cost 3, and that already satisfies Trinisphere's requirement, right? They don't have to pay 4. And these kinds of things that like players just don't really pick up easily on, and I think that that's sort of like the problem with like rule setting cards, is because if you don't know how the rules work at a very, very like intimate level, then you're going to get confused by how some of your stacks pieces run. And if you play at a table and someone else just points out like that's not how that's supposed to interact, you're just going to find yourself shooting yourself in the foot. And so take Michael's advice about building stacks decks. Don't try to like build or pilot like my Heliod decks, for example. But if you are going to go in that direction, be prepared to just learn a lot about the game, because you're probably going to screw this up a lot of times over. If you're playing, like, for example, Lavinia stacks, the Lavinia Discord is really great for that. And in general, a lot of stacks decks by design are just designed to make it streamlined, so it's easier for players to play the deck and not mess themselves up. But if you're going for, like, you know, a breadth first approach and just cover a huge sweeping set of things, once again, just study the rules very carefully. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, for sure. Cobble, what would your kind of final thoughts be, the wisdom you want to impart to people?
2 things, one that's a little bit longer and one that's real short. So just going back to reading opponents. When you're playing stacks, you need to know more about what your opponents are doing than when you're playing any other archetype. When you're playing most archetypes, it's important to know how people are you know, what their lists are going to do, so that you can know, you know, when to interact, when it's most profitable for you to disrupt them, and, you know, those kinds of things, and, you know, like what your windows are going to look like. Playing stacks means that you're going to need to know before people are making their plays what it is that they're probably up to. So you need to learn to anticipate the lines that people are going to be on. So in order to prepare for that, if you're going to be doing stacks, if you're going to play stacks, go and read primers, learn how the really established decks play. If someone's playing against you and it doesn't look like a well-established meta deck, then look at the commander. Is there a straightforward way, like if Najila wasn't a meta deck, you'd still have an idea of how that deck is probably winning. Or, you know, right. Gitrog, that, you know, use your intuition to understand how is it someone's going to use this commander to win. If it's not apparent just from the commander, look at the color identity. Do they have blue and black? Guess what? They're on Oracle and Consultation. Do they have, you know, black? Chances are they're going to be on Adnos. Is there red? They're probably going to play Dockside, maybe Underworld Breach as well. You know, use the information that you have available to make good choices, to guess and anticipate what it is that they're going to do. And the short piece is rule of law is right now the best, I would say, type of stacks that you want to be playing. Because of how powerful it is, but also because of how simple it is. When we were talking a little bit before, we were, you know, how do you decide about, you know, do you attack development, or, you know, do you attack people's ability to win? And how do you choose which things you want to do? Guess what? If you play Rule of Law, you're attacking both. Okay. By playing Rule of Law, you're keeping people from developing, and you're keeping most people from being able to win. So it's very straightforward, it's simple, and it's effective. So that is the type of stacks that you want to be on if you're going to be playing stacks.
Yeah, let me piggyback on that. If you're also build the deck correctly, right, you should not have a hard time playing through Rule of Law yourself personally. But if for whatever reason you built the deck so that it requires a greater level of skill to play, refer back to the whole things that we talked about with like action economy and things like that. Try to just understand sort of how the game is transformed differently. And then the last thing, and Cobblepott's emphasis on the fact that it's good right now, the game is changing. And we're seeing a change in the game itself. One of the things that we kind of covered earlier about card draw and tutor with opposition agent and hole breacher, I want to mention about the fact that this has been creeping up in Magic design for a while now. Like the blue cards that are coming out don't actually really reference draw a card anymore. They're more offensive. Look at the top, however many cards, pick, however many, put them into your hand. And I believe that this is an intentional thing that Magic design is doing. They're also hinting about white card draw. Gavin just released a video like yesterday about it. And he mentioned that the word card draw might not even be part of, the vernacular of how they describe card advantage. So even though like these like anti-draw effects or anti-tutor effects seem strong today, there will be other forms of card advantage and card velocity that will be creeping their way into the meta. And as this escalation occurs where you're playing these Stax pieces, to hate out like effects like demonic tutor or like I'm trying to think of like brainstorm or something like that. Very much easily, you could one day see a blue card get printed that says, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You can put any of those cards into your hand, then put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your library, right? And that completely circumvents everything about Hole Breacher, for example.
Ad Naz already does. Right.
Yes. And Necropotence.
Right.
Yeah.
And Necropotence.
Yeah. I mean, like, but I'm saying that we're in regards to like tutoring, for example, is like the aspect. Like Ad Naz already does that as well, but I'm pretty sure we're going to see more of those types of effects now coming forward, and we'll also probably see cards that interact against those effects. And then the other thing, I realized we forgot to mention about this. The one thing that Stax actually doesn't like, Stax shuts down a lot of things. We've talked about a lot of cards that shut down a lot of things. The one thing that Stax that hasn't been worded onto a card is something that straight out Staxes against triggered abilities in general. Right, you have a Torpor Orb effect that says, creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger, but there isn't something that just says if an ability would trigger, it doesn't, right? And if you are building, if you are building a Stax deck, right? Because that's like because of all the things that brings Magic back to fair play, that has yet to exist, right? Like there are things that prevent players from activating abilities of creatures because that's not typically normal in a game of Magic where you're just playing vanilla creatures. Like think about like the origins of Alpha and Beta where it's like just a Sarah Angel, right? Like a really innocent keyword soup 4/4 flying angel, whatever, right? And it has no abilities on it. It's the purest form of an unadulterated Magic card, and then you like start introducing, like intricate abilities attached to it, and some colors will have these abilities more than others. Some colors can ramp, some colors can draw, some colors can tutor, some colors can play lightning bolt or whatever. And so staxing these things to return back to the neutral state, there has yet to be a card that literally just says no triggered abilities for this game. So keep that in mind when you build a Stax deck. That is probably like, if you see a card that has a triggered ability that isn't just an ETB ability, that might be something that you might want to hinge on when building a Stax deck, because right now that is probably the hardest thing to Stax against. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, honestly, it's been a pleasure getting to talk to you guys. Michael is part of our team and will be featured in more stuff. Excuse me, my chair just dropped a peg out of nowhere on me. That kind of surprised me.
Charles is a teammate too,
Yes.
Well, yeah. Apparently, I'm Michael LeVine. Yeah.
I thought I said Charles.
No, you said Michael.
Charles.
Don't worry. People can. It happens. Seriously, like people like they see mono white guy and they're like, oh, you're the Heliod Ballista player, like, and I was like, no.
You're like, well,
I'm
am
not.
a Heliod Ballista player, but
Do you even have a Heliod Ballista list? I don't think you do.
I did. It wasn't great. I built one with Playing with Power, and this was really funny, is because when it first came out, Playing with Power had like a whole group deck building session, and they were trying to build it, and I was like, I don't think this is the correct way to build it. I think you need to think about this way. And then I gave them like the cards that they should be running, and it was really funny because all the cards that I listed ended up being the cards in your list.
That's good.
Yeah, but no, I mean, like, I saw your list and was like, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I'll just play something else, and I played my version of Heliod that I've been playing like before the new Heliod even appeared, and I've been sticking with that. It makes me feel like a special snowflake, you know, like a special snow plains,
Yeah.
special snow-covered
Oh my
plains.
gosh.
That's why I still play
Well-
Lin Civi, so I understand.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, Charles is part of our team, and we will be featuring him more. It's just been weird. I know you've been moving and stuff like that, so
Yeah, I bought a house.
getting you, yeah. Congratulations, my guy.
Thank you. Adults.
Doing better than me.
Yeah.
But, you know, and also, Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having
You know,
me.
yeah, absolutely. You are welcome anytime. So with that, that about wraps things up for us here today. Just a quick reminder that you can follow us on Twitter at sculptybois, or you can find a direct link in our link tree in the description below if you don't want to try and figure out how to spell sculptybois. Want to give an extra thanks to all of our patrons who help keep the lights on. If you too would like to become a patron, you can head on over to patreon.com/themindsculptors or check out the link in the description. And I do want to let you guys know that as far as a patron reward, I am working on trying to cut it up in a way that it is watchable. But back in November, when we first did our first set of recording sessions, we did a game with me, Pongo, Spleenface, and Charles. And Pongo was playing Derevi, Spleen was playing Tygam, I was playing Lavinia, and Charles was playing Heliod. And it's like a 3.5 hour game, and I'm trying to upload it for patrons, but it's a incredibly large file, so I'm trying to get it to a point where I can like upload it for patrons.
That was a long game, sir.
That was a 3.5 hour game.
Yeah. That game was miserable.
It was awful. But I am working on getting that up and getting some other patron reward stuff up there. One thing to keep an eye on is if you are a patron, if you are the the strategist here, you can help us pick what we're going to do for our Brewer's Choice episodes and things like that. So there's a lot of things that go into that. But thank you again for joining us. And from all of us here at the Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.